Welcome to 7.1 World History, The Rise of Europe. The rise of Europe actually began with the fall of Rome, and the fall of Rome happened around 500 AD. After the Roman Empire fell, Western Europe was cut off from the advanced cultures of Asia and overrun by invaders and divided up. And from a period of about 500 AD to 1000 AD, it was sometimes called the Dark Ages. However, this was a time when Greco-Roman, Germanic, and Christian traditions were slowly blending together to form a new culture and new civilization called the medieval or Middle Ages. During the fall of Rome, the unifying force of the Roman Empire crumbled. And this was a factor of several different things. But in its place, the church took over in administrating and promoting peace in the civilization. The church became the unifying force within the remains of the Roman Empire. It gained its power through a series of slow incremental steps while the Roman Empire was disintegrating. First of all, the Emperor Theodosius made Christianity not just legal but mandatory. It made Christianity essential for anyone who wanted to achieve a higher station in the Roman Empire. He also allowed the church to develop its own court system, and this brought about a new law code called canon law, which was the law used within church districts and for church matters. The church was responsible for instructing the Germanic peoples and giving them new ideas of how to live and social behaviors. Christianity became the cement that held Europe society together. In the early Middle Ages, the Germanic tribes such as the Franks, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Magyars, the Vikings, all invaded repeatedly and eventually blended with the peoples that were already living there. But one group, the Franks, ended up creating a lasting civilization. There was a dramatic decrease in trade and also in classical learning. During the Middle Ages, there was a loss of literacy among the peoples because the invading tribes didn't value learning as the Romans had, and so the Germanic peoples were used to using oral tradition rather than written language. After the fall of Rome, the Germanic tribes carved up Western Europe into small kingdoms. These various invaders were known as the Vandals, the Goths, the Visigoths, and later the Huns, and the Angles and the Saxons, who eventually ended up in the Isle of Britain. The Germans originated from a region that is in present-day northern Germany, or southern Sweden and Denmark, or near the shores of the Baltic. The first tribes to migrate were called the Visigoths and the Goths, and they were agricultural and wanted to settle down and be Romanized. And they had practiced a form of Christianity called Arian Christianity, which basically denied that Jesus was divine. That they said that he was simply a good man who taught good lessons. And this really disturbed the Roman Christians who could not accept this form of Christianity. The movement of the Germanic peoples on the continent ended at about 600 AD. The Visigoths overran much of southwestern Gaul, which is present-day France, and they established their headquarters at Toulouse, which is in the southern part of France. They exercised a very weak domination over Spain until the Muslim invasion in about 700 AD. So the Vandals were another group of Germanic peoples that migrated all the way through North Africa and pushed up into Spain for a while, but eventually, because they did not ever intermarry or mingle with the North Africans, they eventually died out. The Germans could not write, and they didn't keep any records, and especially before they had their conversion to Christianity. So we don't have a lot of written records about their life before they became Christians. The basic German social unit was called the Volk, or this means tribe. And members of the Volk believed that they were all descended from one common ancestor, and that the blood ties between them was more important than almost any other affiliation. So their law was based on custom, and it was things that they valued were bravery and loyalty. They were supposed to be very brave in battle, and if you came off the field with your leader, you would never be able to live down the shame of that. Before Christ, the Germans were mainly animistic. They believed that trees were holy, and to cut them down was an act of grave sacrilege. This attitude prevented them from clearing a lot of land for farming, and it tended to keep the Germans quite isolated from one another. This caused the population to be maintained at a much lower level than later. When the Germans accepted Christianity, it ended their animistic beliefs about there being spirits in the trees and other forces of nature. They began to turn more towards a settled lifestyle rather than being nomadic, and they became what we think of as the Middle Ages in culture and tradition. Although the early Germanic tribes were Arian Christians, the Frankish tribe was unique in that it adopted the Catholic Christian tradition. And it began with a king who decided to convert to Christianity, and his name was Clovis. Clovis had married a Christian queen. Her name was Clotilde, and their first child, she insisted on baptizing when he was born, and it caused the child's death, and this angered the king greatly, but he didn't say anything. And the next child, he forbid her to do that, but she still went ahead against his wishes and baptized the child, and this also caused his death as well. And the king felt a lot of anger about the situation, but apparently in the Frankish culture, women had quite a bit of power as well. And she continued to defy his wishes. And so he was well aware of the Christian tradition based on his firsthand knowledge. But when he was consolidating his kingdom in about 486, he was pushing south with his army and conquering the area that was known as Gaul, which is today part of France. And he was fighting against another Germanic tribe, and it looked as though it was an even match. And eventually the battle started to go against him, and he realized that he was going to lose this battle unless something dramatic happened. And the story goes that he had a conversation with God, or at least he told God that if he did win this battle, that he would convert to Christianity. And by the end of the day, his troops or his warriors had won the battle, and so he followed through with his part of the bargain, and he allowed the bishop to baptize him and all of his troops along with him into Christianity. So as you can see, the Germanic idea of individualism and the need to have an individual decision was not very strong. In 711, Muslims marched across North Africa and invaded into Spain, and were pushing all the way up into modern-day France, but were pushed back in this decisive battle in 732, named the Battle of Tours, because it was fought near the city of Tours. And the Frankish king, or he wasn't actually the king at that point, but he was leading his troops, and they totally crushed the Muslim invaders. And his name was Charles Martel, which is in English means Charles the Hammer. So he got his nickname Charles the Hammer, which is such a modern nickname, it's so funny, by crushing Muslim invaders. Charles Martel's grandson was a man named Charlemagne, and he was in some ways similar to the legendary figure of King Arthur, because he created a kingdom that was much more advanced than the other kingdoms of that time period in that area. He valued education. He saw the need for it because he needed to have educated government officials who could keep records and of taxation and help to run his kingdom well. He also was an avid spreader of Christianity. Every tribe or people that he conquered, he forced by sword point to become Christian. Through all of his conquering, he managed to unite most of Western Europe, including parts of France and Spain, a little bit of Spain, and all the way into Germany and the Netherlands and parts of Switzerland. And so his territory was quite large, and he wasn't able to administrate it all himself. During one of his attempts at consolidating his power, he was given an urgent message by the Pope that the Pope needed rescuing from a Germanic tribe that known as the Lombards, who had come and attacked the papal states in Italy. And Charlemagne sent several of his sets of troops over, and they completely annihilated the Lombards. And the thankful Pope, when Charlemagne showed up in the Vatican, he was at Mass on Christmas Day, and the Pope surprised him, quote unquote, we don't know for sure, with the crown and placed it on his head as he was praying. There are several issues that arose because of this actions. Number one, it symbolized that the church had more power than the state, and this is something Charlemagne absolutely refused to believe. He did not agree with that at all. He felt like he had the power to choose the Pope or to make decisions for the church. So the Pope was doing something very political. He was using the moment to try to assert his own authority above that of Charlemagne. Also, the Byzantine Empire considered themselves to be the leaders of the Christian church, and they also considered themselves to be the rulers of the legacy of the Roman Empire. And so to have the Pope crown a Frankish king as the emperor of the Romans was really a slap in the face of the Byzantine Empire. And this was the beginning of, or rather, a continuation of a very long struggle between East and West or the Byzantine Empire and the medieval Europe in regards to power for the region. Charlemagne accomplished quite a few things under his reign. First, he created a united Christian empire, or at least he created the idea and the desire for a united Christian empire. That was actually never fully accomplished throughout the Middle Ages, and it has never been fully accomplished. But Charlemagne did manage to spread Christianity to many tribes that had refused Christianity up to that point. And the Pope's actions created a schism or a split between East and West. Some of the social accomplishments that Charlemagne was able to do, he briefly reignited the desire to learn, or for learning in the Middle Ages. And he gathered around him some of the scholars of the time period. And his place of, one of his hubs was Paris. And the gathering of those learned men in that area eventually create the situation where they are able to create a university. And the University of Paris ends up becoming one of the oldest universities in Europe. He also sponsored, I guess you could say, the development of something called minuscule. Up to that point, Latin had been written all in capital letters, and his scribes develop a new type of writing that uses a lowercase letter, which he named minuscule. And this is the precursor for our script writing, as opposed to the more Latin style of writing, which would be print. After Charlemagne died, the people practiced the very common practice of dividing up the resources or the territories that the father had owned between the sons. This was the common Frankish practice. And Charlemagne had 3 sons, and so his territory was divided up into 3 territories. They're indicated on this map by the green, which was green, brown, and red. Eventually, those 3 were, the sons fought amongst one another, and it ended up being the only one who gained the emperorship. His name was Lothair. During Charlemagne's conquests in Western Europe, the Muslim armies were trying to gain more territories in Southern Europe, and they managed to capture the island of Sicily and create a small kingdom there. After 900 AD, though, the Muslim attacks started to subside. The Magyars were an Asian people group that had migrated towards Eastern Europe, but in the 900s they started to push into Western Europe, and for about 50 years they were conquering parts of Western Europe, but they were soon pushed back and settled in the country of Hungary, modern-day Hungary. So if you go to Hungary today, you will see the descendants of many Magyar invaders. The Vikings began to raid European coastal towns and river towns as in the late 800s and the early 900s. These Scandinavian peoples were expert sailors, and they wanted to open up trade routes which would link northern Europe to the Mediterranean. But they ended up also settling in places like England, Ireland, Iceland, parts of France, which in what we call today Normandy, Russia, and even pushing all the way over into Greenland and what they called Vineland, which we call Nova Scotia today.